Mhm.
Yeah, give me a second.
Okay. So there will be intro anyway. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of American Alert. My name is Jan Herning. I am editor-in-chief of the Warsaw Institute, and this is my pleasure to welcome Lieutenant Colonel retired Billy Flynn. Welcome to American Alert.
Well, thank you for having me here this afternoon. I look forward to our discussion.
We are going to talk about the war in Ukraine, the war which have been waged for over a month now, which has been waged for over a month. And a few weeks ago, President Zelensky addressed the British Parliament, also the US Congress, where he made a plea to supply the Ukrainian military with fighter jets. And of course, since we know that Ukrainian pilots cannot fly American jets, the issue of Polish MiG-29 emerged, right? So I wanted to ask you about Ukrainian pilots. How do you see them? How do you see their skills and their ability in these aspects of the aircraft war?
I think you ask a question that many of us have pondered, trying to understand what the value, first of all, in the desperate attempts to regain some form of air power in Ukraine, and the stories that come out are about some real impressive heroics of the limited airplanes that are left and the opportunities that those pilots have once they get in the air. What is the value of the question you're asking? What's the value, would be the value of adding
Mhm.
MiG 29s to this equation right now? The MiG 29 is an early fourth generation fighter. It is, in the Polish context, no comparison to the F 16s that are now flown by the Polish Air Force. And so, an old generation aircraft without the self defense capabilities to survive in the highly contested, lethal air environment over Ukraine now, what value would they bring in the air flown by Ukrainian pilots?
Mhm. And
I
you
don't
are.
think
Mhm.
I think it's pretty clear that the MiG 29 is not survivable in this environment right now. So adding more to that equation is not going to help the Ukrainian military gain an advantage over the invaders at this point in time. And it wouldn't matter where those airplanes came from. The MiG 29 is not sophisticated enough in terms of self
Mhm.
defense capabilities to survive flying in that environment. So then you ask the bigger question, what is the risk to NATO to be drawn into this war by supplying the airplanes that will not change the balance of power in this harsh combat environment right now?
So, in your opinion, it would not change much, but would put all NATO states at risk of entering directly to the war. I wanted to ask, since you are a former F-35 pilot, I wanted to ask about the role of NATO, which might be possible in this conflict. We heard a lot about establishing possibilities of establishing a no-fly zone over Ukraine. How do you assess that?
Well, I think it's very, NATO has been very clear that the collective NATO does not want to be dragged into this war at the very, with the very clear risk of then escalating this conflict into a full blown European World War III scenario. And so NATO has to step lightly in how to supply the very brave and courageous Ukrainian military fighters with equipment, yet not be party to a war that none of us want, which would escalate to a scale and to something that is far beyond anyone's worst nightmare. And so you can only stand on the sidelines and unfortunately watch at this point in time. What does Western NATO forces carry in terms of capability? It's a very formidable a series of air forces, which would do significant damage if ever brought into up against the Russian or invading forces. That there's a significant fifth generation capability that would change the balance of power. But I think NATO's made it pretty clear that the collective NATO can't be brought into this fight right now.
But at the same time, we heard lots of experts who said that it would be even better to interfere in the war because right now there are lots of people who die every day, who are dying even at this particular moment. And the only way to stop this tragedy is to straight interference in this conflict to end it as speed as possible, as quick as possible. Will you want to agree with them, with these experts who say that?
And I think there's experts on all sides, and I would include
Yes.
myself as,
Hmm.
as one of those too. And I'm sure, look, not a single person in any country wants to see what is happening in the Ukraine now. And everywhere we turn, the value of you see the value of real time news. We get to see the horrific scenes of what's happening, and it just gets worse every day. Nobody wants to allow that to continue. The scenario would get far worse if we triggered a World War III response and had all of the Russian might turned on all of Eastern Europe. I think we'd see an escalation of damage, death, and destruction that we need to avoid on behalf of the greater continental Europe and wherever that would go.
Yeah, just to be clear, that was the expertise of Professor Clifford Angel Bates, who was also one of guests of our show, who says that recently. But I wanted to ask about this scenario of Third World War, because of course it is not happening right now, but this is still a possibility for us in Poland. This is very real in a way because there are bombs being dropped 10 kilometers from our borders. So we feel it a little bit in here. So I wanted to ask you about NATO eastern flank. I wanted to ask about their combat readiness of the states which form this eastern flank, and also about increased number of U.S. military in this area. Also in Poland, we have 82nd Airborne Division, American Airborne Division. So what's your take on that?
I think what isn't understood by everyone is the collective capability that and interoperability that NATO brings. The number of nations that have sent troops up to the eastern border, like you mentioned, including U.S. services. What's not understood is how well integrated NATO forces really are. How over all the years of doing military exercises together, they've learned to bridge the gaps between nations and cultures and different militaries. And collectively, they're potentially a very potent force and a deterrent, I hope, we all hope, against further Russian aggression.
A few days ago, actually this past weekend, Joe Biden was in Warsaw, where he made another time the same statement that Article 5 of NATO treaty is a sacred obligation for the US. That is the exact quote of from President Joe Biden. I wanted to ask, do you believe we are, as the West, as NATO, really able, are we able to perform this collective response in a scenario of this aggression towards NATO territory?
I believe that none of us imagined
Mhm.
a scenario that could bring all of NATO together and coalesce us with a single mindset as this invasion of Ukraine has done. There is no discord throughout any of the NATO nations of exactly what NATO as a collective needs to do and can do. Do I believe in Article 5 and that it would be one for all mentality? Absolutely. Do I understand the collective capability, warfighting capability of NATO nations and just how lethal and potent they are? Absolutely. Do we ever want to have to exercise that and show that? Never. So I think one of the gross miscalculations of Vladimir Putin is that he probably thought the discord amongst NATO would continue, and it has had the opposite effect. We all collectively now found one single enemy, and our mindset is rock solid, linked together, one nation to the next.
Yes, and another question I will have to you is about the whole issue of the war in Ukraine, because as I already said at the beginning, the war which has been waged for over a month right now. I wanted to ask about your evaluation, your assessment of this conflict so far. Do you believe that the current result of the war is more about Russian military's inability to perform, to conquer this territory, or maybe it is more about Ukrainian soldiers' spirit and also equipment which is being sent from the whole free world right now?
Well, you've answered two parts of the question yourself. One is the inability of the Russian army or the Russian military to execute what was likely their original game plan. But then you also pointed to the second point, which is the astonishing efforts by Ukrainian military and those who have been absorbed by the military to defend their homeland and fight as you would hope a nation would, to fight to protect everything that they believe in. And their successes to this point, I'm sure, have impressed everyone around the world. Extraordinary courage and bravery demonstrated every single day, stopping a massive army. I think what we do recognize is that for the many people that thought large scale warfare was over, we realize it's not. I do know that although we're more than a month into this, all along in these past 4 weeks or so, every expert has had an opinion on the daily progress or stalling of the Russian advance. My experience in combat as the former commander of the Canadian forces, the fighters that fought over Kosovo and Serbia in Operation Allied Force in the spring of 1999, my experience is that the journalists and media experts have a commentary that'll run nonstop, and every hurdle that is encountered or every minor success gets a new headline. It's only a month into a war, and I don't know of any conflict that it would have ended this quickly. The first Gulf War was 39 days. The Operation Allied Force was 69 days. This has a long way to go yet. And while we all cheer for the successes of the Ukrainian
Mhm.
military when they can stall and stop or hinder the advance of the Russian forces, this fight is just getting going.
Does Vladimir Putin did Vladimir Putin overestimate or miscalculated the whole event of the war in Ukraine, in your opinion?
I think he grossly miscalculated the level of fight in the Ukrainian people. That he didn't understand that when you take away someone's homeland, when you threaten their culture, their very being, that they're going to fight till the last man or woman, and they aren't going to give up. And we've seen extraordinary bravery from President Zelensky all the way down to the men and women who are fighting on the streets today. I think Vladimir Putin thought his army uh, would roll right over and occupy the country in short order, and clearly that has not happened.
I still wanted to appeal to your fighter jet pilot experience because it's huge, actually. I wanted to ask about Polish Air Forces. How do you assess our forces? We know that right now we have lots of about 40 something, nearly 50 F-16s. Do you think also in progress there are deals with F-35s, which you perfectly know? Do you believe that these are the best planes, the best tools for the Polish army to defend against such potential invasion and war?
So let's talk about the status of the Polish Air Force now, the Polish military with
Mhm.
the equipment they have. The transition to Western fighters and the adoption of the F-16 Block 52 F-16s, the most advanced version of the F-16 that exists today, was a massive step forward. And in those years since the first airplanes arrived, the Polish Air Force has become enormously capable and lethal with those airplanes, and has always trained against the very real threat that's at your eastern border, and clearly understood
Mhm.
on the eastern flank of NATO just what they would be faced with an airplane that is capable with the proper tactics of surviving in that environment. As you alluded to, F-35, and when that airplane or that platform arrives in the Polish Air Force, that changes everything and moves it to a completely different level. Because F-35 was designed to operate and survive in the very environment that we see over the Ukraine
Mhm.
right now. Highly contested, um, heavily defended environments where a platform would need to be able to manage the surface to air defenses, to be able to achieve air superiority and then do damage on the ground. That's what F-35 is meant to do. And it will at some point. Obviously, those airplanes aren't going to arrive in Poland for this conflict, but that is the future of the Polish Air Force. The step adopting the F-16 and now being very capable F-16 pilots would allow them to operate when and if needed in this conflict.
I wanted to ask also about the second part of our title, so Canadian perspective of this war right now, and ask about Canada's activities because we talk a lot about American US side of this, let's call it help, alliance, and so on. But it is also um, often we do not say much about Canadian part in this help, humanitarian, military. How does it look?
Well, this crisis really rings home in Canada. There are almost 1.4 million Ukrainians that live in Canada. It's third largest population of Ukrainians next to Ukraine and Russia. And so there's a deep seated feeling in Canada that Canadians have to do something to help Ukraine out, whether it's humanitarian or what military aid can be brought to bear. The Canadian military has never been big. It is not lethal at this point in time, under-equipped, undermanned, and what can be sent is probably already been sent in terms of military hardware. The CF-18 would never be survivable in this high threat environment. It has no self-defense capability that would protect against the newer generation surface-to-air missiles that exist right now. So fighter jets are not coming. The Army and a significant manpower plus additional manpower has been sent to overseas, but that's about as much as Canada can bring in terms of military hardware. You could never compare the Canadian
Mm-hmm.
military I was a part of and the US might as the largest, most potent military in the world. There's no comparison one to the next. Canada's a much infinitely smaller military than what the US can bring.
Yes, of course. As I said, I hope I mentioned that retired RCAF combat commander you are. I wanted to ask in a little broader context right now, because in my opinion, we looking at the case of Ukrainian-Russian war, we often overlook the biggest, let's call it, or the most important war between two superpowers. Maybe it's not a war, but competition between the United States of America and People's Republic of China. You already said that the US Air Force is the biggest, most potent air force in the world right now. I wanted to ask if you could assess the Chinese Air Force, if you have information about that. How can we compare this?
So let's take that American context. Don't forget, I lived in the United States for 2 decades, and I'm an American citizen also. When you look at the rest of the world right now is focused on Eastern Europe and the threat of Russia. America has two threats, and the biggest threat is Asia Pacific. Actually, it's China, and its focus in the military is always towards Asia Pacific. You could never compare one to the next, an American hardware to Chinese hardware, or even Russian hardware for that matter. There's no true comparison. There's no match a Chinese fighter or a Russian fighter to the top of the line, most sophisticated American pieces of kit. However, quantity has a quality unto itself. And by that I mean, when there's vast numbers of your enemy against yourself, even if you have a more capable platform, at some point you risk being outnumbered. And that's always been the equation when talking about China. There may be at some point so many of the adversary that it'll be that much more difficult for the American forces to neutralize them all.
So
The
this
Chinese
would be the
is
only
there all the
advantage.
time. Their only advantage is there's just more of them. That's all.
Mhm. Another question I will have to you, also connected to the US, since also President Biden was in Warsaw. I wanted to ask, how do you assess Biden's stance in this conflict? Do you perceive him as the real leader of the free world in this case of response to Putin's bloody regime's actions?
I think President Biden's response to Putin has been very clear from the very beginning, including his releasing intelligence information late last fall, leading through to Christmas and into the winter, showing what Putin was planning to do and calling him out early. And then clearly, including statements this week or weekend, he has been very adamant about his feelings towards Putin. Now, is that a sign of America retaking the leadership responsibility globally? America, for the past number of years, has really let that slide. To change that overnight won't happen. To demonstrate in the coming period that America is willing to become or to reassert itself as the leader of the free world and truly be a leader, I think we have to see whether that will actually play out over time.
And the last question I will have to you is about both geopolitical effects of the war, both for the West and for the East, and also your predictions when could the war end?
Well, I would love to be able to predict this on behalf of
Uh-huh.
everyone. I think I have the same fears we all do that this will escalate beyond what is potentially just what is potentially a Ukraine only conflict and spread across other borders and then ultimately bring us into a fight, us being all of NATO. Nobody wants World War III, and everyone hopes that at some point this can be contained. I don't believe that we understand Vladimir Putin enough to know how far he will push imperialism or what trigger would it take for him to escalate this into a World War III type scenario and attack the rest of NATO. None of us want this to happen. So I'm not a someone with a crystal ball that can do that. I
Mhm.
tell you what the effect though has been, and I think I said it earlier. No one would have imagined a scenario that would have solidified the common the common view that there is a single enemy out there and that we are collectively against that enemy. We want to be the good guys against evil, and we haven't seen that mindset since World War II. We've dealt with asymmetric warfare all around the world. We certainly dealt with it in the Balkans, multicultural conflicts. Now there's a single foe out there, and NATO is united. Look at the change of philosophy of Germany, in a very short order, ordering new fight F-35 jets and increasing the military stance almost overnight. Look at the resolve throughout NATO, plussing up military spending, unifying the voice against Vladimir Putin. I think there isn't a single scenario around there that could have brought us collectively together like this action has. And I believe we will have changed the world order for decades to come because we're not going to forget this. And there will be a price to be paid by Russia economically within the borders of Russia that will stand for a long time. He has created a pariah that we will not let fade away for many, many years to come. And I think the resolve now of NATO we're going to see for decades to come.
Yes, and we all hope the Russia and everyone responsible for this bloody war in Ukraine right now will pay the price. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel William Billy Flynn was my and your guest, global strategic advisor and consultant. I will read it because there is lots of it. Former F-35 Lightning II senior experimental test pilot and retired RCAF combat commander. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me today. I enjoyed our discussion.
Me too. Thank you so much.